there are doors in the mind that should never be forced open. Once you invite the shadows to sit at your table, they will never stop eating until you are completely hollow. 2007. Arkham Valley, Massachusetts. An old, wealthy, isolated New England enclave steeped in colonial history and surrounded by dense, suffocating woods. It started with a photograph. We were sitting in the grand parlor of the estate, the massive stone fireplace crackling behind us, driving away the damp Massachusetts chill. My husband was reading the evening paper, and Thomas, his younger brother, was pacing the floor with a frantic, almost feverish energy. "You have to see her, Eleanor," Thomas said, thrusting a small, glossy photograph into my hands. "Her name is Marguerite. I met her at a gala in Boston. I've only known her a few weeks, but I'm going to marry her. I have to marry her." I looked at the photograph. The woman staring back at me was undeniably striking. She had pale, porcelain skin, sharp aristocratic features, and hair the color of midnight. But it was her eyes that caught me off guard. They were dark, intense, and seemed to pierce right through the glossy paper. There was a cold, calculating gravity to her stare that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "She's beautiful, Thomas," I said carefully, handing the photo back. "But a few weeks. Don't you think you're rushing things? Marriage is a lifelong commitment, especially in our family." "You don't understand," Thomas insisted, his voice taking on a desperate, glassy quality. He clutched the photograph to his chest as if it were a religious relic. "I can't stop thinking about her. When I close my eyes, I hear her voice. When I sleep, she's in my dreams. I cannot physically live without her. We are getting married at the end of the month." I exchanged a worried glance with my husband, but there was no reasoning with him. Thomas was entirely consumed. He looked less like a man in love and more like an addict experiencing withdrawals. 3 weeks later, Marguerite moved into the Arkham Valley estate. From the very first day, the atmosphere in the grand old house shifted. The air grew stagnant and heavy, smelling faintly of wilted lilies and burnt sage. Marguerite was polite, almost excessively so, but it was a cold, practiced politeness. She moved through the dark, echoing hallways of the mansion like a shadow, her footsteps completely silent. And Thomas had changed. The vibrant, talkative younger brother was gone. He followed Marguerite around the estate like a mindless drone, his eyes dull and completely devoted. He agreed with everything she said, bought her whatever she demanded, and snapped violently at anyone who dared to contradict her. I tried to be welcoming. I really did. As the elder sister-in-law, it was my duty to integrate her into the family. But she made it impossible. The first real incident occurred on a Tuesday evening. I had asked Martha, our loyal housekeeper of 20 years, to prepare my favorite chamomile tea to help me sleep. When the silver tray arrived in my study, it wasn't Martha holding it. It was Marguerite. "I thought I would bring this to you myself, Eleanor," Marguerite said, her voice smooth as velvet, her dark eyes completely unreadable. A gesture of sisterly affection. "Thank you, Marguerite," I replied, forcing a smile. I picked up the delicate china cup and took a sip. The taste was horrific. It wasn't chamomile. It tasted like ash, copper, and something sickeningly sweet, like rotting fruit. I immediately gagged, slamming the cup back down onto the saucer. "What is this?" I choked, reaching for a napkin to wipe my burning tongue. Marguerite's expression didn't change. She just stood there, staring down at me with a cold, predatory calmness. "It is a special blend, Eleanor. Very popular where I come from. It brings clarity. It makes people see who is truly in charge." "I asked for chamomile," I said, my voice hardening. "Please don't bring me this again." "Of course," she whispered, turning to leave. As she walked out the door, she looked over her shoulder, a terrifying, jagged smile stretching across her face. "Drink up, Eleanor. It's bad luck to waste a gift." That night, the nightmares began. I woke up screaming, drenched in a freezing sweat. In the dream, Marguerite had been standing over my bed, chanting in a language that sounded like grinding glass, her hands dripping with thick, black sludge. My husband had to hold me until dawn to stop my shivering. I tried to tell Thomas about her behavior, about the strange tea and the terrifying look she had given me, but he flew into a blind, terrifying rage. "Don't you ever speak ill of my wife." Thomas roared, his eyes wide and bloodshot, slamming his fist down on the dining table. "She is perfect. She is an angel. You're just jealous of her, Eleanor. You can't stand that someone else has my attention." He was completely unreachable. The Vashikaran, the dark magic of total subjugation, had entirely consumed his mind. He was no longer a husband, he was a puppet on her strings. But Marguerite's ambitions didn't stop with Thomas. She wanted the entire house. She wanted total control of the family estate, and I was the only thing standing in her way. A week later, I was walking past Thomas and Marguerite's bedroom when I heard the chanting. It was a low, rhythmic, guttural sound, vibrating through the heavy oak door. I stopped, holding my breath, and pressed my ear against the wood. Om Shreem Reem. Om Shreem Reem. It wasn't a prayer. It was an incantation. I carefully knelt down and peered through the large, antique keyhole. The room was completely dark, save for the flickering light of dozens of black candles arranged in a wide circle on the hardwood floor. Sitting in the center of the circle was Marguerite. She was holding a small, crudely fashioned doll wrapped in a piece of fabric I instantly recognized. It was a piece torn from one of my own silk scarves. She held a long, rusted needle in her right hand. Her eyes were rolled completely back into her head, exposing only the terrifying, milky whites. "Break the elder," Marguerite hissed, her voice sounding distorted and unnatural, layered over itself. Break the pillar. The house belongs to the shadow. She raised the rusted needle and violently plunged it directly into the chest of the small doll. At that exact second, a blinding, agonizing pain erupted in the center of my own chest. It felt like a jagged piece of ice had been driven straight through my sternum. I gasped, stumbling backward away from the door, clutching my heart. The pain was so intense I couldn't scream. I could only let out a strangled, breathless wheeze. I collapsed onto the floor of the hallway, my vision blurring into a chaotic swirl of gray and black. The door suddenly swung open. Marguerite stood over me, looking down at my writhing, agonizing form. The black candles flickered behind her, casting long, demonic shadows across her face. She wasn't hiding it anymore. The polite facade was completely gone. "You see, Eleanor," Marguerite whispered, leaning down so close I could smell the sickening stench of copper and burnt sage on her breath. "This is what happens when you stand in my way. You are old. You are weak. And this house is mine now. If you try to cross me again, the next needle goes into the doll's head." She stepped over my gasping body and walked calmly down the stairs, leaving me paralyzed in excruciating pain on the hallway floor. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with a manipulative woman. I was dealing with a witch. And she was going to kill me. The pain from the rusted needle didn't just fade, it retreated deep into my bones, leaving a cold, hollow ache in the center of my chest that throbbed with every beat of my heart. I lay on the hardwood floor of the hallway long after Marguerite's silent footsteps had faded into the cavernous depths of the mansion. When I finally dragged myself to my feet, clutching the oak banister for support, the reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating burial shroud. I was trapped in my own home with a predator. And the predator was wearing my sister-in-law's face. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological torture. Marguerite didn't attack me directly again. She didn't need to. She began to systematically dismantle the foundation of our household, starting with the people who were loyal to me. Martha, our housekeeper, was her first victim. Martha had been with our family for nearly 30 years. She had helped raise Thomas. She knew every creaking floorboard and drafty window in the Arkham Valley estate. And, more importantly, she had eyes. She had noticed the missing kitchen knives, the strange, foul-smelling herbs stashed in the pantry, and the small, oily black stains appearing on the carpets near Marguerite's bedroom. Marguerite knew Martha was a threat. It happened on a torrential Thursday afternoon. The sky over Massachusetts had broken open, hammering the slate roof of the mansion with freezing rain. I was in the library when I heard the screaming. It was Thomas. I rushed into the grand foyer to find my brother-in-law towering over Martha. His face was a mask of unhinged, blood-red fury. He was gripping Martha by her uniform collar, practically lifting the terrified, frail older woman off the ground. "You thieving old hag!" Thomas roared, his voice echoing violently off the stone walls. "How dare you steal from my wife? After everything this family has given you." "Thomas, stop!" I shouted, running forward and grabbing his arm. "What are you doing? Let her go." Thomas shoved Martha away. She collapsed onto the marble floor, weeping uncontrollably, clutching her apron to her chest. Marguerite stood calmly on the grand staircase, looking down at the scene with a placid, detached expression. In her pale hand, she held a heavy, antique silver brooch, a family heirloom that Thomas had given her on their wedding day. "She was stealing it, Eleanor," Marguerite said, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "I walked into my dressing room and caught her trying to slip my wedding brooch into her apron pocket. I am so heartbroken. I thought she was family. It's a lie." Martha sobbed, looking up at me with terrified, pleading eyes. "Mrs. Eleanor, I swear on my mother's grave, I was just folding the laundry. She planted it there. She handed it to me and then started screaming. Shut your mouth." Thomas bellowed, taking a menacing step toward the old woman. His eyes were entirely devoid of the boy I had known. The Vashikaran magic had hollowed him out, leaving only a violent guard dog fiercely protecting its master. "You are fired, Martha. Pack your bags and get out of this house before I call the county sheriff and have you thrown in a cell." "Thomas, you can't be serious," I pleaded, stepping in front of him. "Martha has been here for 3 decades. She practically raised you. She's a thief." Thomas spat, pushing past me. He pointed a trembling, rage-filled finger at the front door. "Get out. Now." I looked up at the staircase. Marguerite was looking right at me. Behind Thomas's back, her lips curled into that same, jagged, demonic smile. She gave me a slow, mocking wink. Martha packed her bags in tears and left into the freezing rain. With her gone, Marguerite had effectively severed my right hand. The house felt emptier, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. But isolating me wasn't enough. Marguerite needed to win over my husband, Arthur. Arthur was a pragmatic man, a banker who dealt in numbers and logic. He had remained neutral, dismissing my complaints about Marguerite as simple adjustments to living with a new family member. Marguerite needed a miracle to conquer his skepticism. So, she manufactured a crisis. 2 days after Martha was thrown out, Arthur collapsed in the dining room. It wasn't a normal fainting spell. He hit the floor convulsing, his skin turning a horrific shade of ashen gray, a thick, black bile bubbling from the corners of his mouth. "Arthur!" I screamed, dropping to my knees beside him, frantically trying to wipe the bile from his airway. "Thomas! Call an ambulance! Quickly!" But Thomas just stood there, staring blankly, waiting for Marguerite's command. Marguerite glided into the dining room, holding a small, steaming wooden bowl. The smell radiating from it was nauseating, a mix of rotting sulfur, burnt hair, and something deeply metallic. "An ambulance won't make it up the mountain road in this storm, Eleanor," Marguerite said calmly, kneeling next to my dying husband. "His heart is failing. The stress of the business has poisoned his blood. But I can draw the poison out. Get that foul concoction away from him." I shrieked, trying to push her hands away. "Let her do it." Thomas snapped, suddenly grabbing my arms and hauling me backward with terrifying, unnatural strength. "She knows the old ways. Let her save him." I fought, screaming and thrashing against Thomas's iron grip, but I was powerless. I watched in absolute horror as Marguerite pried Arthur's jaws open. She didn't pour the liquid into his mouth. Instead, she dipped 2 pale fingers into the black sludge in the bowl, smeared it across Arthur's forehead, and began to chant that same, grating, glass-crushing incantation. "Draw the rot, bind the breath, return the pulse." She pressed her sludge-covered hand directly over Arthur's heart. Instantly, Arthur's back arched violently off the floorboards. He let out a massive, tearing gasp, his eyes snapping open. The gray pallor vanished from his skin. The black bile stopped bubbling. Within 10 seconds, he was sitting up, blinking in confusion, completely and miraculously cured. What happened?" Arthur gasped, clutching his chest. "You suffered a massive coronary failure, Arthur," Marguerite said softly, playing the role of the humble savior. "I used a very old, very potent herbal remedy to stabilize your heart. You are safe now." Arthur looked at Marguerite, his pragmatic mind entirely shattered by the impossibility of his immediate recovery. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated gratitude. You saved my life, Marguerite. I don't know how to thank you." I felt my stomach drop into a bottomless abyss. The trap had snapped shut. Arthur was completely won over. In his eyes, Marguerite was a saint. But I knew the truth. Witches don't cure natural illnesses, they cure the curses they themselves cast. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I crept out of my bedroom. The air in the hallway felt thick, like wading through deep, freezing water. I made my way down to the kitchen, desperate for a glass of water to calm my frantic nerves. As I passed the back door leading to the gardens, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Marguerite was standing on the back patio in the freezing rain. She was holding a small, burlap sack. I hid behind the heavy velvet drapes of the dining room archway and watched. She wasn't disposing of medicinal herbs. She untied the sack and dumped the contents onto the wet cobblestones. It was a collection of dead, mutilated crows, bound together with black twine and stuffed with rusted nails and graveyard dirt. It was the physical anchor of the sickness she had cast upon my husband. Having cured him, she was discarding the evidence. She turned around, wiping the blood from her hands onto her nightgown, and walked back inside. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear boiled over into pure, desperate rage. I stepped out from behind the curtain and blocked her path in the dimly lit hallway. "I saw you," I hissed, my voice trembling with absolute fury. "I saw the birds, Marguerite. I know you poisoned Arthur. You made him sick just so you could play the savior and win his trust." Marguerite stopped. For a fraction of a second, her dark eyes flashed with a terrifying, predatory malice. The shadows in the hallway seemed to physically reach toward her. "You don't know what you're talking about, Eleanor," she said, her voice dropping an octave, sounding demonic and hollow. "I know exactly what you are." I shouted, no longer caring if I woke the house. "You are a witch. You used Vashikaran on Thomas. You framed Martha. And you tried to kill my husband. I am going to the police tomorrow. I am going to tell them everything. I am going to drag you out of this house by your hair if I have to." The moment I threatened her, the demonic presence vanished. The shadows retreated. Marguerite's entire demeanor violently shifted. The cold, calculating monster disappeared, replaced by a frail, terrified, weeping girl. She collapsed to her knees on the hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. "Please," she wailed, tears streaming down her porcelain cheeks. "Please, Eleanor, don't. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." I was completely taken aback by the sudden display of vulnerability. I stepped back, clutching my robe. "I grew up so poor," Marguerite sobbed, looking up at me with wide, pathetic eyes. "I just wanted to belong here. I wanted Arthur to accept me. I wanted you to accept me. The magic, it's all I know. My mother taught it to me to survive. Please, Eleanor, don't tell Thomas. He'll throw me out into the street. I have nowhere to go. I'll stop. I swear on my life, I will burn my altars tonight. Just please, give me one more chance." She crawled forward and wrapped her arms around my ankles, weeping into my slippers. Looking back, it was the greatest, most fatal mistake of my life. I was a woman who valued family and peace. I saw a desperate, broken girl begging for mercy. The maternal instinct overrode my survival instinct. "Get up, Marguerite," I sighed, the anger draining out of me, leaving only a profound exhaustion. "Stop crying." She looked up, her face stained with tears. "I won't tell Arthur or Thomas," I said, my voice stern. "But this is your final warning. If I ever see a black candle, a drop of blood, or a rusted needle in this house again, I will not hesitate. You will destroy everything you brought with you, and you will be a proper wife to Thomas. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Marguerite whimpered, nodding frantically. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you. You are so kind. I turned and walked back upstairs, believing I had won. Believing I had broken the witch. I didn't see the look on her face as I walked away. I didn't see the fake tears dry instantly, replaced by a glare of absolute, unholy hatred. Marguerite didn't burn her altars that night. She went back into her dark bedroom, locked the door, and prepared to cast the most horrific, deadly curse in the dark arts arsenal. It is known in the old texts as the Salem Rot, the Black Death. It is a curse that doesn't just kill, it systematically tortures the victim for exactly 40 days, slowly severing their soul from their body until they go completely mad and their organs dissolve into ash. I was asleep in my bed when the ritual began. In her room, Marguerite drew a massive circle of crushed bone and sulfur on the floorboards. She placed a photograph of my face in the dead center. She didn't use a rusted needle this time. She used a heavy, iron railroad spike, heated until it glowed a blinding, cherry red. She chanted the words of the Salem Rot, her voice vibrating with demonic power. Bind the breath. Blacken the blood. 40 days to the grave. 40 nights to the rot. She raised the glowing iron spike and drove it violently, forcefully, directly through the face in the photograph, pinning it to the hardwood floor. 2 rooms away, I woke up screaming. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a physical, catastrophic agony. It felt as though a white-hot spear of iron had been driven straight through the center of my skull, pinning me to my mattress. The pain was so intense my vision went completely black, and blood began to pour violently from both of my nostrils, soaking the white silk pillows in crimson. Eleanor. Arthur shouted, waking up beside me and turning on the bedside lamp. He recoiled in horror at the sight of me. Good God. Eleanor, what's happening? I couldn't answer. I was choking on my own blood. My entire body locked up in a rigid, agonizing seizure. My back arched so violently off the bed I heard a rib pop. The first day of the 40 days of hell had begun. By the end of the first week, I was a shell of a human being. The doctors Arthur brought from Boston were completely baffled. They ran every test, drew pints of blood, and took endless X-rays. The results were impossible. My blood pressure was bottoming out, my internal temperature fluctuated between freezing and boiling, and dark, terrifying black bruises began to bloom across my skin in the shape of handprints. It's a degenerative autoimmune collapse, one doctor guessed, his voice trembling as he looked at my rotting, blackening fingernails. But I've never seen it progress this rapidly. It's as if her body is actively digesting itself. They pumped me full of morphine, but the drugs did absolutely nothing to touch the pain of the dark magic. By day 20, the physical torture was joined by psychological annihilation. The Salem Rot breaks the barrier between the waking world and the realm of the demonic. I could no longer tell if I was awake or asleep. The grand bedroom became a prison of absolute terror. When Arthur left the room to speak with the doctors, the shadows in the corners would detach themselves from the walls. Tall, spindly, faceless figures would crawl across the ceiling, dropping thick, freezing black sludge onto my face. I would scream, thrashing against the damp bed sheets, but no sound would come out of my mouth. Marguerite would come to visit. She would walk into my bedroom under the guise of bringing me soup or fresh water. The moment Arthur closed the door, she would drop the act. She would stand over my bed, her eyes glowing with that sickly, yellow light. 20 days left, Eleanor, Marguerite would whisper, leaning down until her lips brushed my ear. Your heart is beating so slowly now. I can hear it struggling. Tomorrow, I'm going to turn your liver to ash. Stop, I begged, my voice a wet, rattling gasp. Please, take it back. You threatened me, Marguerite sneered, her jagged teeth clicking together. You showed me mercy, which means you are weak. The weak do not survive in the dark. This house is mine, Eleanor. Arthur is writing the estate over to Thomas tomorrow. He thinks you won't survive the week. And he is right. She laughed, a sound like a shovel scraping across a tombstone, and glided out of the room, leaving me drowning in my own deteriorating body. I was going to die. I could feel the tether holding my soul to my flesh fraying, snapping thread by thread. The doctors had given up. Arthur was weeping in the hallway, preparing for a funeral. And the witch was preparing to claim the throne. But Marguerite had made one crucial mistake. She had forgotten about the people she had thrown away. On the 25th day, when the rain was hammering the Arkham Valley estate once again, there was a knock at the heavy oak front door. Arthur opened it to find Martha, our fired housekeeper, standing on the porch. She was completely drenched, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her in the freezing rain was an old man dressed in a heavy, tattered tweed coat. He carried a large leather satchel and a walking stick carved entirely out of bleached white bone. I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Arthur, Martha said, her voice shaking but resolute. But I know what is happening in this house. The doctors can't save Mrs. Eleanor. You need him. Arthur looked at the strange, imposing old man. Who are you? The old man stepped forward, his eyes burning with an intense, fiery clarity that cut straight through the gloom of the storm. My name is Elias, the old man rumbled, gripping his bone staff. I am a practitioner of the old ways. And your wife is dying from a curse that I have hunted for 30 years. Let me in, before the rot takes her soul completely. Elias stepped over the threshold of the grand mansion, and the moment his heavy leather boots hit the hardwood floor, the temperature in the foyer seemed to violently snap back to normal. He didn't wait for Arthur to take his coat. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply closed his eyes, took a deep, rattling breath through his nose, and grimaced. The stench of the grave is already in the floorboards, Elias rumbled, his voice possessing a gravelly, commanding weight. He opened his eyes and locked them onto my terrified husband. "Take me to her. Now. We are out of time." Arthur, completely out of his depth and shattered by weeks of watching me decay, nodded frantically. He led Elias and Martha up the grand, sweeping staircase. I was fading in and out of consciousness when the bedroom door swung open. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol, rotting flowers, and old blood. Elias walked straight to the side of my bed. He didn't flinch at the horrific, blackened bruises blooming across my neck, or the thick, black blood crusting my nostrils. He reached into his tweed coat, pulled out a small piece of rough, unpolished silver, and pressed it gently against my forehead. The silver instantly hissed, turning pitch black in his fingers. Elias pulled his hand back, his expression darkening into a mask of pure, absolute fury. "The Salem rot," Elias spat, looking at Arthur. "It is the most foul, parasitic curse in the dark arts. It takes 40 days to systematically digest the soul, preparing the meat for the demons of the lower dark. Your wife has been subjected to 25 days of absolute agony. By the 30th day, her heart will turn to black ash in her chest. Can you cure her?" Arthur begged, falling to his knees beside my bed, tears streaming down his exhausted face. "I'll give you anything. The estate, the money, anything." "You cannot cure a curse with medicine or money," Elias said, pulling a heavy, rusted iron chain from his leather satchel. Attached to the end of the chain was a jagged, swinging pendulum made of bleached bone. The Salem rot requires a physical anchor. The witch who cast this must have used an object, a photograph, a piece of hair, a drop of blood, and bound it to the dark with an iron nail. We must find the anchor and sever the binding before the 40th day, or she dies. But who would do this? Arthur cried out. "The answer is already inside your house," Elias said grimly. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open. Thomas stood in the doorway. His eyes wild, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. Marguerite stood right behind him, her face perfectly calm, but her dark eyes were burning with a lethal, panic-stricken hatred. "Get this charlatan out of my house," Thomas roared, marching into the room with his fists clenched. "Arthur, have you lost your mind? Bringing some vagrant into Eleanor's sickroom. I'm calling the police." "Thomas, wait," Arthur started. "No." Thomas spat, reaching for Elias's collar. "He leaves right now." Elias didn't even blink. As Thomas lunged forward, the old man reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a handful of coarse, gray powder, a mixture of crushed grave dirt and sea salt, and blew it directly into Thomas's face. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes rolled into the back of his head, and he collapsed onto the carpet like a puppet whose strings had been violently cut. "Thomas!" Arthur yelled, rushing forward. "He will sleep," Elias said calmly, stepping over the unconscious brother. "His mind is infected. He has been subjected to Vashikaran, a dark subjugation spell. The witch controls his every waking thought. But while he sleeps, her grip is broken." Elias turned his piercing gaze toward Marguerite. Marguerite didn't scream. She didn't feign innocence. The mask completely shattered. Her jaw unhinged slightly, and a low, terrifying, multi-layered hiss escaped her lips. The shadows in the bedroom began to physically writhe and stretch toward her. "You step in the territory of the old gods, old men," Marguerite's voice rumbled, sounding like grinding stone. "Leave this house, or I will turn your bones to dust." "You invoke the old gods like a child playing with matches," Elias countered, holding up the bone pendulum. The jagged piece of bone was violently vibrating at the end of the iron chain, pointing directly at Marguerite. "The anchor is near her. The mother goddess of the light will guide me to the rot." Marguerite raised her hands, her fingers curling into jagged claws. She began to chant the demonic verses of the Salem rot, preparing to strike Elias with a concussive blast of dark energy. "Arthur! Break the door!" Elias roared. Arthur, finally realizing the horrific truth that had been hiding in plain sight, didn't hesitate. Fueled by weeks of terror and the impending death of his wife, my husband lunged forward. He didn't hit Marguerite, he slammed his shoulder directly into the heavy oak door of her and Thomas's private bedroom, which she had locked from the outside. The door splintered and burst open. Elias rushed inside, holding the violently swinging pendulum. The grand, luxurious bedroom had been turned into a desecrated temple. The windows were blacked out with thick paint. The walls were covered in jagged, terrifying sigils drawn in dark, dried blood. The smell of rotting sulfur was so intense it made Arthur violently dry even the doorway. The bone pendulum swung wildly, pulling Elias toward the center of the room. He dropped to his knees on the massive, Persian rug, throwing the heavy fabric aside. There, in the dead center of the hardwood floor, was the horrifying epicenter of my torment. A massive circle of crushed bone and sulfur was burned into the floorboards. In the middle of the circle was a photograph of my face. And driven directly through the center of my forehead, glowing with an unholy, blistering red heat, was a heavy iron railroad spike. Thick, black, oily sludge was bubbling out of the floorboards around the iron, pulsing with the slow, dying rhythm of my own failing heart. Marguerite shrieked, a sound of pure, demonic desperation. She leaped onto Elias's back, clawing at his eyes, trying to pull him away from the circle. "Don't touch it!" Marguerite screamed, her voice tearing her vocal cords. "If you break the seal, the toll must be paid. They will take me. They will take me instead." Elias ignored her claws digging into his neck. He began to chant an ancient, deafening prayer of protection, his voice drowning out Marguerite's shrieks. He reached forward and wrapped his bare, calloused hand directly around the blistering, white-hot iron spike. His flesh sizzled and smoked, but Elias didn't even grunt. With a massive, guttural roar of pure defiance, Elias ripped the iron spike out of the hardwood floor. The world erupted into chaos. The moment the spike was removed, the photograph of my face instantly disintegrated into white ash. 2 rooms away, I let out a massive, tearing gasp. The excruciating, white-hot pain in my skull vanished. The crushing weight on my chest evaporated. For the first time in 25 days, I drew a deep, clean, painless breath of air. The black bruises on my skin began to visibly fade, retreating like shadows fleeing the dawn. But in Marguerite's bedroom, the nightmare had just begun. The dark magic of the Salem rot is an absolute contract. The demons of the lower dark were promised a soul in 40 days. By breaking the anchor, the contract was nullified. But the hunger of the dark is eternal, and the toll must always be paid by the one who signed the pact. Marguerite fell backward off Elias, screaming in absolute, unadulterated terror. The black sludge that had been bubbling from the floorboard suddenly erupted outward like a geyser. It wasn't just liquid, it was a mass of writhing, shadowy tendrils. The tendrils wrapped around Marguerite's ankles, pulling her violently down onto the hardwood floor. "Help me!" Marguerite shrieked, reaching out toward Arthur. Her porcelain skin was rapidly deteriorating, turning gray, cracking, and peeling away like old parchment. Her beautiful black hair turned stark white and fell out in massive clumps. "Arthur, please. Don't let them take me." Arthur stood frozen in the doorway, horrified, watching the monster that had tortured his wife face the ultimate consequence of her own malice. The shadowy tendrils crawled up Marguerite's legs, wrapping tightly around her waist, her chest, her throat. They burned through her clothes, searing her flesh. Her eyes, those cold, dark, predatory eyes, widened in ultimate agony as the absolute dark began to force its way into her mouth and nose, suffocating her screams. With one final, sickening crack of shattering bone, the shadows violently contracted. Marguerite's body imploded. She didn't bleed, she simply collapsed into a pile of dry, black ash and tattered silk. The shadows hissed, swirling violently around the ash pile for a fraction of a second, before being sucked back down into the small hole in the floorboard where the iron spike had been. The room fell dead silent. The heavy, suffocating stench of sulfur faded, replaced by the smell of rain blowing through the open windows of the mansion. Elias stood up, his right hand severely burned and blistered, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked down at the pile of ash that used to be a woman. "The dark does not forgive," Elias whispered, picking up his leather satchel. "And it never leaves empty-handed." The recovery was slow, but it was miraculous. Within a week, I was walking the halls of the Arkham Valley estate again. The doctors from Boston called it a spontaneous remission. They wrote medical papers about my impossible recovery, desperate to find a logical explanation for an illness that science had no right to understand. Arthur fired them all. He had seen the black sludge. He had seen the shadows. The man of logic had watched the walls of reality crumble, and he would never look at the world the same way again. Thomas woke up 2 days after the exorcism. The Vashikaran was completely broken. When we told him what had happened, when we showed him the desecrated bedroom and the pile of black ash, his mind snapped. The guilt of what he had allowed into our home, of what he had almost let her do to me, was too much to bear. He moved out of the estate and admitted himself to a quiet sanitarium in upstate New York. He rarely speaks now, and he never sleeps without the lights on. Elias and Martha disappeared into the rain that very same night. Arthur tried to offer the old man a blank check, but Elias refused. He said his payment was the destruction of the rot. He left us with a warning, etched deep into my memory: you have survived the witch, but you live in a house that the shadows now know by name. Keep the salt at your doors, Eleanor. Keep the iron by your bed. The dark is patient. We still live in the grand, Gothic mansion in Massachusetts. We still throw lavish dinner parties, and from the outside, we look like the perfect, wealthy New England family. But the guest room, Marguerite's room, is permanently locked. We sealed the door with heavy iron chains and thick deadbolts. Because sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the wind howls through the ancient oak trees and the temperature in the house drops just a little too fast, I can hear a sound coming from behind that locked oak door. It sounds like long, jagged fingernails, desperately scratching against the floorboards from the inside out.